I think I'll invite David. David, I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
I think I'm unmuted. Yep, thanks.
Okay, and I can just let me know. I'll advance your slides for you.
Super. So next slide. This was just to kind of put a placeholder in there. I know that it probably doesn't feel like less than a year since I started in this position, since you guys have seen me multiple times. But certainly I have taken to the role like a fish to water and have appreciated the opportunities to, in many places, be the face of DEP at brownfields related meetings. So I'm going to do a kind of a summary of the last, I'll call it a year, even though I'm still 2 weeks to my anniversary date. And Liz has confirmed for me there is not a probationary period, so they can't get rid of me next week. Or they could, but probably not easily. So one of the great things that I have talked about in brownfields world is how brownfields redevelopment projects are really a team effort. If there's a really well-financed construction project, they're not hindered by environmental contamination. But where brownfields kicks in is when there are sites where either the scale of the problem is unknown or the scale of the problem is significant, like larger than the value of the property. And so it really takes a bunch of different resources and partnerships to help make that development process happen. But one of the great aspects that we have nationally is the opportunity to learn from folks in other areas. And so NUMOA is very active here in the Northeast, so the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. And the NUMOA hosted a meeting in June, and that included all the New England brownfields coordinators, statewide coordinators, but also because that meeting was held in the EPA's Boston office, we were able to bring a bunch of MassDEP staff. And so it was an opportunity to learn from what the other New England states are doing, how they're prioritizing their efforts, how we are using our bipartisan infrastructure law funding. And I've got another slide to talk about that. And just making sure we're kind of making the most of these resources. So NUMOA is the Northeast. At SWAMO is the Association of State and Tribal Solid Waste Management Officials. And Millie Garcia Serrano is currently the president of at SWAMO. So this is the national organization that includes all 50 states and I think it's 9 territories. I'm sorry, DC plus 5 territories. I should read my own slide. And that's, again, a really great opportunity to go to these meetings and learn how folks are dealing with these problems. And so at SWAMO covers all the federal programs in the environmental world, so including Superfund, and I was focused on brownfields. The major takeaways that I took from those efforts were in stakeholder engagement and environmental justice process. And so Liz mentioned the EEA and EJ strategy document. I was able to come back and bring some comments kind of up through the MassDEP EJ team and share what we learned from folks in other states and other communities about how they're implementing kind of the best practices and making sure that we learn from those. So those were meetings in larger scale meetings in April and June. In Detroit in August was the National Brownfields Conference, and that included over 2,500 attendees from across the country. And again, like my goal there was to go and learn how folks are doing what they're doing in other parts of the country and bringing that back and sharing that with the MassDEP regional brownfields coordinators and Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup staff. Also in March, and forgive me for not going in chronological order, we had a team meeting of the New England Brownfields and UST/LUST program folks at the EPA Boston office. The bipartisan infrastructure law brought over $1.3 billion into the Brownfields program, and it brought a grand total of 0 new dollars into the LUST program. And so one of the goals of that meeting, and really kind of a priority of the EPA, was looking at sites that might have a Venn diagram that overlaps the LUST program and the Brownfields program. And so I'm working with Dave Buckley in our LUST program and the federal funds program to highlight sites that have are kind of old, abandoned, back-burnered properties that might have LUST problems. This can't be sites that were 21J eligible. So these are kind of really orphaned properties. And as I'll talk on the next slide about the bipartisan infrastructure law, or another slide. But we're really trying to highlight some sites where maybe we can use some brownfields money to get some tanks out of the ground, because those tank removals are an allowable activity with those funds. And then last is the Brownfields Coalition of the Northeast hosted the Northeast Sustainable Communities Workshop yesterday and the day before. And so that was really focused on the Northeast, but BCONE starts in Maryland and Pennsylvania and Delaware up through Maine. So we had about 230 people in Worcester at the AC Hotel. Really great event. And I had fantastic engagement with EPA and the other state regulatory agencies. But again, because it was in Worcester, I had the benefit, we had 10 MassDEP staff. And at the end of my slides, I'll share an image of those folks with you. But the key thing there, besides in that group, Kevin Doust, who's a long timer in the brownfields world, everyone else that came are the more mid-level to early career professionals. And so this was an opportunity for them, maybe their first time to go to an in-person brownfields meeting and interact with, so lots of developers, financiers, attorneys, environmental engineers, and consultants, and kind of meet and greet, because you don't do brownfield stuff sitting at your desk and only filling out forms. You really kind of need to work with folks and team up. So it's really a nice opportunity for me to introduce those folks and give them an opportunity to interact with people in the brownfields community. So next slide, please. So on that note, when I started last year, I highlighted that I wanted to take advantage of a program that the city of Worcester has done for a long time, which is called, back in the day when Tim Murray was mayor of Worcester, he created the Mayor's Brownfields Roundtable in Worcester. And I have taken that on a statewide level. And we hosted a meeting in Worcester in March and had 75 plus people. In Brockton, we hosted a meeting at the Old Colony Planning Council in May and had 45 people. And so it's just an opportunity to kind of network, mix and mingle, regulators, people from the regional staff, again, developers, nonprofits, the folks who are getting involved with brownfields. Really importantly, the regional planning commissions. So 2 weeks ago, we hosted one in Pittsfield. So the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission co-hosted with me, but we also had the FRCOG, Franklin Regional Council of Governments, and Pioneer Valley Regional Planning Commission. Their representatives were there. Each of those three regional planning commissions receive brownfields funding this year. And so those grantees, those folks are able to work with all the communities in their regions. And so that was maybe the best meeting that I've been to all year, because there were private property owners, there were developers, folks who owned mills, folks who owned problematic properties, and they were reaching out and saying, what do we do next? And one of the key things to be eligible for brownfields grants is kind of not to be the for-profit entity that caused the contamination. And two really key ingredients that we see in Central Mass, one is the Worcester Business Development Corporation. They have a nonprofit wing that can kind of be an assist and work with folks because they're grant eligible. Out in Western Massachusetts, a similar entity is called West Mass Development Corporation. They've been redeveloping the Ludlow Mills property in Ludlow. And they reached out and they came to this meeting because they have capacity to help other folks. So literally, people who bought the Strathmore Mill in Russell asked the question, like during the conference, what do we do next? And I said, well, in 10 minutes, why don't we meet out in the hall? And you from the town, you from the Regional Planning Commission, Jim Byrne from the EPA, Rich Griffin from Mass Development, let's set up that next meeting. So we can, like right now, we can talk about what those next steps are for you. And they're likely to be able to team with the West Mass Development Corp, and the Regional Planning Commission is going to be able to help them with assessment. And so those are just a great opportunity for people to make like real life connections that a week later can lead to meetings that lead to the next steps for brownfields redevelopment. And so anyway, my intent is to continue with these on an annual basis, because doing one per region per year feels like the right level of density. And I'm hoping to get a meeting up in the Northeast region, depending on which Regional Planning Commission will tag team with me later in the fall. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned this phrase a few times. It's a team effort. I am happy to talk with folks about the program overall and ways to connect with other agencies and other funding sources. But when it comes to understanding the actual kind of sites and details of what DEP knows about these different properties, I hand those questions off to our regional coordinators who I've listed here. And then you'll see highlighted in red there, the key thing is that each of these regional teams are kind of filling the pipeline with good staff that are relatively new to the agency and are learning about brownfields and are learning about how the wayside cleanup program can work with these next owner. You know, we're not necessarily dealing direct in the brownfields world with the folks who owned the site when the contamination happened. When people call me and say, is this site eligible? I often say the property is less important than the next person. If you're the next owner, you are more likely to be an eligible party or an eligible person under Chapter 21E. And so it's the next person that becomes the brownfields developer. It's kind of less about the property in that case. So anyway, we've got just a great team of entry to mid-level staff that are learning more about brownfields and it's great to be helping them learn about the process and introducing them to the people in their regions. So next slide, please. So I know I mentioned this probably back in March, but one of the interesting things that happened this past year with the bipartisan infrastructure law was the EPA granted funds to MassDEP specifically. And the brownfields team, so the folks who were on the previous slide, had, before I joined the department, but I agree with this approach, said, let's spend this money on kind of those backburnered, abandoned, ignored sites, the sites that no one's dealing with and are not touching. And with the priority of trying to do as many of those in EJ communities as possible. But in addition to EJ, the EPA is also prioritizing funding, especially bipartisan infrastructure law funding, to smaller communities, low population communities of less than 5,000 people. That's their number. We're just kind of using a soft number of smaller communities that don't necessarily have municipal resources, municipal staff that can deal with the problems. So in this case, for the first year, we've got projects lined up and either with a SARS contractor, so that's the consultant or engineering firm that works directly for MassDEP under our competitive bid process. But SARS contractors have already been selected for sites in Bridgewater, Brimfield, Fitchburg, and Wareham. Because we're spending brownfields money, that work has to happen under, like any assessment and sampling, has to happen under EPA's approval process with a site-specific quality assurance project plan, a QAP. And so right now, we've had our first QAP approved for the site in Fitchburg. We've got 2 QAPs in with comments back, so they're about to be approved for Brimfield and Wareham. And so we'll be seeing actual boots on the ground and drilling and sampling happening in the next few weeks at those sites. And then I'm working with the regional coordinators with respect to the projects in Framingham, Southbridge, and Peabody as well. Really, the key here is either municipal ownership or kind of high priority for the municipality, but also looking at sites that have kind of been ignored and abandoned and don't have anyone else who can help. And if we can make a difference and get a couple of these sites cleaned up and moved forward so the municipality can do something with it, that would be a great use of the resources. And so our first year, we got $880,000, $840 goes into effect next week, October 1st. And we're anticipating really similar funding levels for the 5-year window of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Next slide, please. So what's next? So a key thing, literally the week I joined DEP a year ago, the EPA asked me, will you be applying for, they call it the CWAG Street, so the Community-Wide Assessment Grant for States and Tribes. So that's it's a competitive grant. So similar to when you see municipalities or regional planning commissions applying for competitive grants. This is competitive, but it's only for states and tribes. So there's a pretty small community of folks who can apply. And it's a $2 million. And if we get that grant, we'll be able to use that assessment money anywhere in the Commonwealth. So one of my key goals in the next 2 months is getting that grant application together so MassDEP can apply for a $2 million brownfields grant. And if we get that, we'll be focusing that grant on assessment, which can only be used for assessment, and the bipartisan infrastructure law money will then be focused on just cleanup. Right now, the bill money is being used for both assessment and cleanup, but it'd be great to take advantage of this funding opportunity during the life of the bipartisan infrastructure law. One of the other things that I've talked about in previous meetings, and I just want to touch base, is that DEP continues to coordinate and engage with other folks doing things that aren't just brownfields. So our Clean Energy Results Program, the DEP's EJ team, and there's the Solar in Massachusetts, renewable target, SMART is Solar in Massachusetts Renewable Target Program. And they reach out to us to kind of validate that sites meet the criteria for being brownfields. And so that's one of my roles that I took on from Ken so that he could help with the regulatory updates and focus on that. And so that's one of the things that I do when the other internal state agencies reach out with questions about brownfields. So then on my hit list is also planning the next year's brownfields roundtables. And one thing I wanted to highlight for you folks who are environmental professionals and might want to share your professional opinions and expertise or maybe success stories is that NUMOA will be hosting the Brownfield Summit. They do that every other year. And next year it will be in Portland, Maine at the end of May, so May 2024. But the reason I'm mentioning it now is that the call for presentations is currently out, and you have about 4 weeks to put together a presentation suggestion or an application. And so if you want a link to that, feel free to reach out to me. I can share that with you. Anyway, so that's time critical in the next month or so. And then Liz, do you mind if I try to share my screen and I will show one other slide that I put together?
Let me make sure you can.
I don't think I can yet.
Okay, I think you can now.
Okay, let's try. You have to stop sharing.
Oh.
And if that's an inconvenience, it's not a big deal.
I think I can handle it.
Okay. Right now, I'll try to share just to make life complicated. Anyway, so I'm sharing this because what I really want, actually, can you see it? No?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And do you see a group of people?
I do.
Okay, great. So this is an example of that next wave of environmental professionals who work for wayside cleanup, who attended this BCON conference. So not shown is Kate Carvalho from the Southeast region, because I didn't catch her when I was gathering the group photo. But so we have Connor Kung, Eric Johnson, Reem Frage, Letitia Ruiz Boyle, Yosef Goitom, Amy Sullivan, Kevin Doust, and Mark Mattis. We just have a great team out there, and it's really energizing for me to see them interacting. You know, they sometimes paired up and stayed together and went from room to room and went to classes and went and participated in the program. But it was just great to see them interacting with other environmental professionals. And I got nice feedback from the folks at EPA Region 1. There were probably, over the 2 days, there were 6 or 7 EPA Region 1 people who were there. And that gave me an opportunity to make sure, you know, some of them they've met. Everyone seems to know Jim Byrne, but some of the other EPA staff are also earlier in their career, first few years in their career. And it's really important that our DEP staff and the kind of early to mid-career EPA folks know each other, because they're the people who will be working together for the next 10 or 15 years. So I just wanted to highlight that, you know, it's, even though I like to be public presence, it's really important that we have a big DEP team working on this process. So I will stop sharing, and that wraps up my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you all for your attention. Are
there any questions for David?
Super.
Okay.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, David. And I must say, there's a tremendous amount of work being done in brownfields. It's really nice that we've reinvested in brownfields program from a DEP perspective, and David moving forward with events such as the roundtables, and supporting our regional staff that are doing this work. The timing couldn't have been better for us in terms of the federal money that's now available. So it's really a real positive development overall in the program. And I very much appreciate the energy that David brings to this.
Thank you. Actually, I'll chime in with Commissioner Heipel gave the opening keynote remarks on Tuesday, and she gave me a little pat on the back for my enthusiasm. So I'll just say that is much appreciated. Thank you.
If only we could bottle whatever you have, David. I could use some of that.
It might be having less than 1 year experience of the department. So.
Oh, Susan. Oh, that's a applause, not a question. Thank you. So I will begin sharing again and move on to MCP amendments.